Before we talk about medieval toilets, we need to set the mood. The year is somewhere between 1100 and 1350. You're not sitting on porcelain, there's no toilet paper, and privacy is not a given. In fact, you're lucky if you even have a designated place to go. Because in the Middle Ages, when nature called, the answer was often inconvenient, public, smelly, and occasionally dangerous. Most people today think of medieval times as dark, dirty, and drenched in disease. That's not entirely wrong, but it's not entirely right either. Hygiene did exist. It was just different. Priorities weren't exactly the same. You didn't flush. You hoped gravity and distance would do the job for you. And if you were poor, the odds were you had to walk a bit, squat a bit, and hope for the best. Let's start with the basics. What did toilets look like in the Middle Ages? If you were rich, and I mean castle-level rich, your toilet was called a garderobe. Sounds fancy. It wasn't. A garderobe was basically a wooden bench with a hole in it, built into the outer wall of the castle, sometimes with a small stone shaft underneath. Waste would fall through the hole, ideally into a moat or onto the ground below, occasionally into a pit, occasionally into the heads of unlucky passers-by. This is why you didn't stroll beneath castle overhangs unless you were feeling brave. The garderobe had a few problems. It didn't smell good. It didn't drain particularly well. And if you think sitting over a freezing stone hole in the middle of a snowy winter sounds miserable, you'd be right. But it was considered advanced for its time. Some castles even had multiple garderobes in different towers, so you could poop with a view. Royalty had options. The rest of the population had other strategies. In towns and cities, toilets were a mixed bag. Some homes had cesspits, deep holes dug into the ground, lined with stone or wood, into which waste would collect. You'd build a simple seat above it, and hope the smell didn't drive you out of your own home. Cesspits needed cleaning, and the people who did that were called gong farmers. Their job was to shovel human waste out of cesspits and carry it away. They were often paid well, not because people respected them, but because nobody else wanted the job. You had to work at night, when the streets were quieter and the smell less likely to cause panic. Imagine walking through a medieval street after midnight and seeing a man hauling buckets of human waste, sloshing softly with every step, heading toward the outskirts of town to dump it into the river. And then imagine he slipped. That was a medieval occupational hazard. Gong farming wasn't just unpleasant. It was hazardous and occasionally fatal. Some workers died from the fumes or fell into the pits they were cleaning. You don't come back from that. For those who didn't have cesspits, options got creative. Chamber pots were common. Basically, portable toilets made of clay or metal. You did your business in the pot, then dumped it somewhere. Maybe in the garden, maybe in the street, maybe out the window. There were laws against dumping waste into the street, but they were hard to enforce. Some towns even passed ordinances requiring you to shout before emptying your pot. Guard loo! That was your warning. If you heard it, you stepped aside. If you didn't, you got a surprise. City streets weren't paved. They were mud, straw, manure, and whatever else people decided to discard. Rain turned them into rivers of sludge. Summer dried them into cracked, foul-smelling trails. You could smell a medieval city long before you saw it. The stench wasn't constant, but it lingered. And toilets were part of that landscape. Public latrines existed, especially in larger cities. These were communal toilets, usually set near rivers or flowing water, and shared by dozens of people. They weren't private. They weren't particularly clean. But they were functional. You sat in a row, did your business, and let the current take it away. The River Thames in London was a favorite dumping ground. So was the Seine in Paris. These rivers weren't just water sources. They were garbage chutes, laundry stations, bathhouses, and toilets all at once. Monasteries had better arrangements. Monks were surprisingly hygienic. Many abbeys had elaborate systems of running water, channeled through stone pipes from nearby springs. Latrines were built above these channels, letting waste flow away. Some monasteries even had two-story latrines with multiple seats. It wasn't luxury, but it was organized. And quiet. Monks didn't talk during toilet time. Silence was a virtue, even when relieving yourself. Now, toilet paper. Spoiler, it didn't exist. Not in the way we think of it. People used moss, grass, rags, leaves, hay, or just their hand. In colder climates, snow was an option. In some places, a sponge on a stick was shared among users and rinsed between uses. That sounds horrifying today, but standards were different. Clean meant not visibly filthy. Comfort wasn't the point. Function was. In some wealthier households, soft cloths were used, washed and reused. And if you were traveling, you planned ahead. Pilgrims and merchants carried their own wiping tools. Sometimes bits of cloth, sometimes smooth stones. You didn't want to be caught unprepared in the middle of nowhere with a full bladder and no leaves in sight. Toilets weren't the only issue. Where people went wasn't always planned. In rural areas, people relieved themselves in fields, forests, or behind hedges. In cities, they used alleys, corners, stairwells. Night soil collectors complained constantly about people treating every wall like a target. Some cities tried to regulate it. Fines were issued. Walls were marked. But you can't police every alley in a medieval maze. Some of the worst sanitation problems happened during sieges. When a castle or city was under attack, and food and water were limited, toilet facilities became a disaster. Latrines overflowed. Waste was dumped into wells. Disease spread fast. Dysentery was common, and it wasn't a polite illness. It hit hard, fast, and violently. Soldiers died not from swords, but from dehydration. Siege toilets were pits in the ground, hastily dug, rarely maintained. You went, you covered it. You prayed it didn't back up. The smell of a besieged city could tell you how bad things were. When the air turned sour and heavy, it meant the cesspits were full, the corpses were piling, and hope was thinning. Toilets weren't just about comfort. They were about survival. Good waste management meant fewer diseases. Bad systems meant outbreaks, death, and collapse. Now, not all medieval toilets were disasters. Some cultures had better systems. The Islamic world, for example, had more advanced sanitation. In cities like Baghdad and Cordoba, public baths and toilets were common. Water was used for cleaning. Hygiene was tied to faith. Cleanliness wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. These cities had sewer systems, bathhouses, and toilets with running water centuries before much of Europe caught up. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. In China, too, toilets had a longer history. Some regions developed rudimentary flush systems. Others used composting methods. Bamboo sticks were used instead of toilet paper. Again, not glamorous, but functional. So, when we say medieval toilets, we're really talking about a wide range of setups, from stone seats over moats to chamber pots under the bed, from monastic pipes to peasant fields. And each setup came with its own smell, risk, and strategy. Let's talk etiquette. Yes, even medieval bathroom behavior had rules. In castles, guests were expected to clean up after themselves, or at least aim properly. Servants were responsible for emptying chamber pots, but they weren't expected to tolerate disrespect. Tossing waste in a careless way could lead to scolding, fines, or social shame. In some places, your pot had to be emptied before sunrise. Doing it during the day was considered rude. In monasteries, toilet use was regulated by bell. Monks had specific times for bodily functions, often tied to prayer schedules. Talking during those times was forbidden. Humor was discouraged. Bodily functions were necessary, not amusing. If you broke the rules, you weren't flogged, but you might lose privileges. Toilets were serious business. And then there's the design. Let's go back to garderobes for a moment. They weren't just about waste disposal. They also had secondary purposes. Some people stored clothes in them. The logic: the ammonia from the waste killed fleas. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked. So if you had a fur coat full of lice, you might hang it near the garderobe for a day or two. That's one way to dry clean your robes. Garderobes also became weak points in castles. During sieges, attackers occasionally entered through the toilet chute. It wasn't common, but it happened. A narrow stone shaft, often vertical, sometimes wide enough for a man to crawl through. If you were desperate and immune to disgust, you could climb up the waste channel and emerge in someone's private chamber. Surprise! It's not just your digestion that's ruined. Castle architects eventually figured this out. Some garderobes had traps. Not mechanical ones, just architectural ones. Bends in the shaft, sharp turns, or narrow pinch points to prevent intrusion. You might slip in, but you wouldn't get back out, and the smell would keep most invaders away anyway. Let's talk about toilets and crime. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, toilets could be sites of danger, deception, or scandal. In some towns, cesspits were hiding places, not for treasure, but for secrets. If you had something to hide, a letter, a stolen item, maybe a body, you might toss it into a cesspit, where the stink alone discouraged investigation. In a world without forensics, waste pits were nearly perfect erasers of evidence. City guards dreaded cesspit duty, not because someone might be hiding there, but because now and then, they'd be ordered to investigate one. Rumors of infanticide, stolen property, or even witchcraft sometimes led to latrine searches. And while no medieval CSI unit existed, occasionally a suspicious disappearance or odd smell would provoke someone to lift the latrine board and peer down into darkness. It didn't always end well. There are records, scattered and vague, of people being assassinated while using a toilet. The most famous case may be King Edmund Ironside of England, allegedly murdered by a spear thrust upward while he sat on a privy. The details are debated, but the story stuck because it confirms one of the most universal truths in history. No one wants to die on the toilet. It's undignified, unavoidable, and apparently historically accurate. Toilets were also points of gossip. In crowded towns and cities, where people lived stacked in tenements, the thin walls between apartments meant you could hear everything, including your neighbor's digestive schedule. Privacy wasn't a right. If you had a chamber pot, you might share it. If you used a public latrine, you sat in a row, shoulder to shoulder, trying not to look left or right. Conversations happened. Rumors spread. Love affairs began. Business deals were whispered, all while seated. And when things went wrong, toilets caused more than embarrassment. They caused damage. Poorly built cesspits collapsed. In London, a man once fell through the floor of his outhouse when the supporting structure gave way. He survived, though his dignity did not. Others weren't so lucky. Some died of exposure to methane gas. Others simply drowned in filth. It was a slow, dark way to go, and no one wanted to be remembered for it. Medieval builders eventually started designing better pit covers, more stable outhouses, and warning signs. Though literacy wasn't common, so signs were often symbols or carvings. A crossed-out figure squatting might mark a sacred space. A rude carving of a man relieving himself might warn that this wall is not to be used as a urinal, though in practice it still was. Speaking of urinals, they were rarely separate from toilets. Men peed where they could: walls, corners, barrels, bushes. Some churches had stone troughs outside for public urination. They were practical, low maintenance, and better than doing it on the church wall itself. Though that happened too. Priests often preached against wasting water upon sacred stone. A poetic way of saying, stop peeing on the sanctuary. Let's also talk fashion. Yes, even medieval toilets had a dress code. Or at least, certain clothing considerations. Long tunics, layers of wool, and tightly laced bodices made using the toilet an ordeal. Undressing took time, especially in winter. And there were no bathroom stalls, no coat hooks, no clean floor. You either held up your robes or let them drag. Many poor folk went without underclothes for simplicity. Richer people had servants who helped them dress, and sometimes helped them undress, even for toilet time. This leads us to the concept of the closed stool. A closed stool was a sort of portable throne, essentially a chair with a hole in the seat and a chamber pot underneath. It often had a lid, and sometimes even padding. Royals and nobles used these not just for comfort, but as a social device. The close stool could be used during private meetings, with a servant nearby, ready to carry away the pot. The line between power and discomfort was thin. If you had to go, you didn't stop ruling. Servants known as grooms of the stool were responsible for managing their lord's toilet needs. It sounds degrading, but it was a position of trust. The groom had intimate access to the king, and this meant power. They overheard secrets, managed schedules, and often became powerful advisors, all while handling waste. It's a strange hierarchy, but it reflects how intertwined sanitation and status really were. Children, of course, learned early where and how to go. There were no potty training manuals. Parents taught by example, scolding, and occasionally tethers. Yes, children were sometimes tied with cords to keep them near a latrine or prevent them from falling in. Falling into a pit wasn't funny. It was dangerous, potentially fatal, and very hard to recover from socially. Animals had different standards. Pigs wandered the streets. Dogs defecated wherever they pleased. Horses were messier than anyone. In cities, animal waste contributed to the general smell. Some cities employed street cleaners to sweep muck from the roads, but it was a losing battle. In wet seasons, streets became sludge pits. In summer, they became odor ovens. And yet, amid the mess, there was method. Some waste was reused. Human waste, mixed with straw, was composted and used as fertilizer. Not everywhere, and not always safely, but the idea existed. Farmers knew that night soil made fields grow. Risky but effective. Some towns even had early attempts at waste zones, dedicated dumping areas, away from wells and markets. It didn't always work, but the effort mattered. Now, let's zoom in on the experience of using a medieval toilet. You're in a stone tower. It's night. There's wind howling through the cracks. Your torch is flickering. You walk down a narrow corridor to the garderobe, holding your robes in one hand and a chamber pot in the other. You slide the wooden door closed behind you, not that it latches, and sit on a stone bench, cold as the grave. You stare at the wall, trying not to look down the hole, which echoes faintly with the sound of distant dripping. There is no toilet paper. You reach for the cloth square hanging nearby, worn, scratchy, damp. You do your business. You try to wipe. You try not to gag. And then you shuffle back to your chamber, hoping your servant remembers to empty the pot before morning. That was high class. Now imagine a peasant's experience. You wake before dawn. You walk behind the barn. The grass is wet. The air smells of manure. You squat quickly, hoping the neighbors aren't watching. No paper. No cloth. You use leaves, oak, if you're lucky. You bury the waste with your foot, out of habit, or just out of respect for your own nose. Medieval people weren't immune to disgust. They just accepted it differently. Smell was part of life. A stinking latrine wasn't shocking. It was expected. People carried scented herbs in pockets or pouches to mask the smell. Richer people held pomanders, perfume-filled balls, near their faces. In winter, the cold helped. In summer, nothing helped. Bathing helped, sometimes. But bathhouses were rare and often doubled as social clubs or brothels. People bathed less than we do today, though not as rarely as the stereotype suggests. Weekly washing was normal in some places. Others bathed monthly or seasonally. Cleanliness was a virtue, but it was also seasonal. You were clean enough for your status, your climate, and your patience. Some towns had public bathhouses with adjacent toilets. The idea was convenience. Clean yourself, then relieve yourself, or vice versa. These bathhouses weren't silent. People gossiped, negotiated, flirted. The lines between public and private were always blurry. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. And so, the medieval toilet wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a cultural artifact. A window into class, technology, belief, and biology. It was shaped by architecture, law, superstition, and necessity. It smelled bad, worked badly, and still somehow endured. The remnants are still with us. In some old castles, you can see garderobes jutting out over the walls, their stone chutes worn smooth by centuries of use. In old cities, archaeologists have found cesspits beneath buildings, still filled with fragments of pottery, bones, and traces of human waste. Their time capsules, preserved not in amber, but in excrement. They tell us what people ate, what diseases they had, what parasites they carried. They show us the history of digestion, of architecture, of shame. They remind us that behind every grand hall, every noble feast, every famous battle, someone still had to go, and someone else had to clean it up. Toilets weren't hidden. They were part of life. They were mentioned in records, laws, diaries. People argued about them, joked about them, complained about them. And while they didn't shape empires, they supported them. No castle runs smoothly with full cesspits. Now let's move beyond the walls of castles and cities, out into the countryside, where most medieval people actually lived. For the average peasant, toilet design wasn't about architecture or engineering. It was about convenience, proximity, and occasionally superstition. There were no blueprints, no inspections, no formal sanitation plans. The closest thing to a bathroom for most villagers was a spot behind the house, out of sight, preferably near the pigsty or compost heap. Maybe it was a dugout pit. Maybe it was just a worn path to the same patch of earth. It depended on weather, privacy, and how often the family moved their grazing area. In some cases, the toilet was a simple wooden outhouse, a hut with a hole in the floor and a pit beneath. Not all homes had these. Wood took effort to acquire, and in many small communities, people shared. Several families might use the same pit. Some took turns digging new ones. Others didn't dig at all, relying instead on open fields. This kind of living, open-air toileting, seems appalling today, but it was just part of life. It wasn't sanitary by modern standards, but the rural setting meant waste had more room to disperse, and it became part of the ecosystem. Chickens scratched at it, pigs ate parts of it, flies swarmed it, and rain spread it. Still, the people weren't unaware of the risks. They may not have understood bacteria, but they knew bad smells could bring illness. They associated sickness with miasma, foul air rising from rot, which means they tried, in their own way, to limit exposure. Some built crude covers for pits. Others tossed ash or straw over waste to reduce the stench. Some believed that certain times of day were more safe to relieve oneself, based on folk beliefs or even astrological charts. Nighttime was seen as more dangerous, not just because of wolves or bandits, but because of spirits. It was said that witches traveled through the air at night, and relieving yourself at the wrong hour could expose you to curses. A midnight trip behind the barn wasn't just unpleasant. It was, for some, a spiritual risk. And in communities where superstitions ran strong, toilet behavior was tied to ritual. Some people muttered prayers before squatting. Others avoided relieving themselves near sacred trees or stones. In parts of northern Europe, folklore warned against urinating near fairy mounds, lest you provoke the wrath of the hidden folk. If your cow suddenly sickened, or your child developed a fever, someone might trace it back to where you emptied your bladder 2 nights ago. And so, even the act of relieving yourself was laced with meaning. Practical, yes, but also mystical and sometimes feared. Now shift again. From the farm to the battlefield. Soldiers in the field had few options. Armies on the march didn't carry toilets. Latrines were hastily dug trenches, often shallow, narrow, and dug too close to camp. Commanders tried to enforce rules about latrine placement. Downhill from water sources, away from food stores, but discipline varied. And when soldiers were camped for weeks or months, the waste piled up. In muddy conditions, these trenches overflowed. In dry conditions, they stank. Dysentery was common, spreading like wildfire through cramped tents. It was known by many names: bloody flux, camp fever, the Red Death, and it could decimate an army faster than swords. Doctors knew little about prevention, but they knew bad smells meant bad news. They burned herbs. They scattered lime. But still, the soldiers suffered. Some generals, like the Romans before them, tried to plan latrines carefully, building rows of trench toilets, sometimes with wooden seats and digging deep pits. But in chaos, cleanliness collapsed. And when retreat was necessary, the trenches were abandoned, open, toxic reminders of human fragility. Sieges were worse. If you were inside a besieged city or castle, with no escape and limited space, the question of waste disposal became immediate. Cesspits filled, garderobes clogged, chamber pots overflowed. People began to relieve themselves in stairwells, corners, or over the walls. The stench grew unbearable. So did the danger. Feces near the well? Disaster. Corpses buried near the garden? Contamination. Some sieges lasted months. Toilets were dug in courtyards. Buckets were used and dumped at night. Rain helped, washing waste into the streets and out through the drains. But it also helped spread disease. And as hunger set in and food ran out, people's immune systems weakened. A single latrine could become a death trap. If you slipped into one, you didn't always come back up. Siege toilets were not about dignity. They were about desperation. And sometimes, they were about deception. During the siege of a particular castle, historians differ on which. Defenders placed fresh waste outside the walls every night, to make it appear they still had food and water. In truth, they were starving. But the trick bought them time. The enemy believed the city could endure, and so delayed an assault. Toilets as psychological warfare. Now leave the battlefield and return to the monasteries. Let's go deeper into those latrine systems we mentioned before, because in many ways, monastic toilets were the best of their time. Monks lived by rules, strict, rhythmic schedules governing prayer, work, meals, and sleep. And that included toileting. Large monasteries had latrines built over flowing streams. Wooden seats with holes were arranged in rows, sometimes a dozen or more. Beneath them, water flowed through stone channels, carrying waste away. It wasn't clean by modern standards, but it was effective and quiet. Monks didn't speak while relieving themselves. Silence was the rule. You'd walk into the latrine building, sit beside your fellow brother, and listen to the sound of water and wind. Maybe bird song outside. Maybe the creak of wood. No jokes, no conversations, just stillness and gravity. Some monasteries had warm seats, wooden planks that absorbed the sun. Some had ventilation shafts, and they were maintained, swept, rinsed, and respected. Monks saw bodily functions as part of creation, not shame. The body was a vessel. It needed care, not ridicule. And so, toilets weren't shunned. They were part of the rhythm of life. Let's talk about water. Clean water was a challenge, especially in growing towns. Wells were common, but if they were dug near latrines, contamination happened fast. People didn't understand bacteria, but they noticed patterns. Drinking from the wrong well made you sick. Wells near the tannery or butcher shop were suspect. Smart towns built their toilets downhill from their wells. Others learned the hard way. In cities with rivers, water was fetched and used, but also fouled. The Thames, the Seine, the Tiber, all were used for bathing, drinking, and dumping waste. Upstream was life. Downstream was death. The phrase, "don't foul your own water," wasn't metaphor. It was survival. Some towns built public fountains fed by aqueducts or spring pipes. These became gathering places, cleaner than rivers, though still communal. People washed hands, faces, food, but not often bodies. Full-body bathing was rare. Water was precious, and you didn't want to be seen naked unless you were very young, very old, or very dead. Now and then, someone bathed too often. That raised eyebrows. Cleanliness was suspicious. Was it vanity? Was it magic? Was it foreign? In some places, too much soap meant too much pride. But too little washing, and people noticed. The balance was delicate. So was the balance in how you smelled. Scents mattered. You didn't want to reek, but you didn't want to smell exotic. Herbal sachets were common. Lavender, rosemary, mint. You tucked them in sleeves or belts. Not perfume, but protection, a barrier against the stench of the street. And yet, no matter how many herbs you carried, the latrines still smelled. They always did. Back in castles, garderobes were sometimes built over running water. A small stream diverted through the base of the tower, carrying waste away. Not common, but elegant. One step above the usual vertical drop. The most elaborate castles had multiple garderobes, sometimes one per bedchamber. Some were decorated with carvings or painted walls. Others were dark, damp, and infested with rats. Because yes, rats. Toilets attracted vermin. Rats climbed cesspit walls. Mice nested in straw near the hole. In winter, animals sought warmth. Some ended up in latrines. Some climbed out, and people told stories about it. Tales of rats biting unmentionable places, of serpents curled beneath the seat. Were they true? Maybe, maybe not. But no one wanted to find out the hard way. So people knocked, tapped the stone, made noise before sitting. Not for others, but for whatever lived in the dark. And let's not forget the smell again. In hot weather, the stench of an unventilated latrine could be unbearable. Some castles built shafts for airflow. Others used lime to neutralize odors. But many just endured. You went fast. You breathed shallow. You got out. If you were lucky, there was a curtain. Not a door. Just a cloth draped over the entrance. It fluttered in the breeze. It didn't block sound. It barely blocked sight. But it gave the illusion of privacy. And sometimes, that was enough. For women, toilets were harder. Layers of clothing. No dedicated female latrines in most public spaces. Chamber pots used behind screens. Servants assisting. Dignity was harder to protect. And in childbirth, things were worse. Sanitation was poor. Midwives did what they could, but infection was common. And death, not rare. Toilets weren't just functional. They were part of the larger structure of life and death, of wealth and poverty, of access and denial. There's a quiet kind of resilience in the way medieval people approached the messier parts of life. They didn't have the tools we do. No disinfectants, no flush buttons, no scented candles, and yet they coped. They adapted. They found ways to manage the unavoidable, bodily functions, waste, and the social awkwardness that surrounded both. Let's walk now through a medieval street, not as an outsider, but as someone who lives there. It's mid-morning. The sun hasn't yet baked the stones, but you can already smell yesterday. Someone has just emptied a chamber pot out the second-story window. You hear the splash, the hiss, the faint grunt of effort, and then silence. No apology, no warning, just gravity. Below, the narrow lane is wet. It never fully dries. You step around puddles. Try not to think about what's in them. A pig shuffles past, rooting through a heap of garbage. A dog barks from somewhere behind a shuttered door. A woman is sweeping her threshold with a bundle of twigs, not because it will stay clean, but because there's comfort in trying. You're heading to the market, but halfway there, your stomach turns. Something didn't sit right last night. The bread was stale. The ale was warm. You need to go. Not in an hour. Not in 10 minutes. Now, if you're lucky, there's a public latrine nearby. A wooden shed overhanging the river. If you're not lucky, it's already full, or closed for cleaning, or recently collapsed. You might have to improvise. A quiet alley. A spot behind a cart. You're not alone in this. Everyone, from merchant to mason, has played this game of urgency and location. In winter it's worse. The ground is hard. The wind slices through your clothes. You can't feel your fingers, let alone untie your layers. And the seat, if you find one, is stone or wood, biting cold. There's no warmth in the act. No comfort. Just necessity. And the hope that you won't slip. Some households tried to make it better. A padded lid, a fur-lined cloak, a candle stub for light. But the cold finds you. It always does. Now consider the sounds of the medieval toilet. Not modern ones. No flush, no hum of plumbing. Just the creak of wood, the splash of water, or worse, the whisper of cloth, the occasional grunt. And silence. Not polite silence, just the absence of conversation. Because no one talks while using the latrine. Not unless they have to. Not unless they're comfortable, which most people aren't. And then there's the cleaning. Who cleaned the toilets? In castles, it was servants unseen, unsung, underpaid. In cities, it was night soil men and gong farmers. In monasteries, it was junior monks. In peasant homes, it was yourself. Always yourself. Cleaning was done with shovels, buckets, cloths, and lime. Sometimes vinegar. Sometimes nothing. You held your breath. You muttered prayers. You got it done. Clothes were affected too. Smells clung to fabrics, to hands, to hair. Washing helped, but only a little. And soap was precious. Made from animal fat and ash. It was rough, gray, and harsh. It cleaned, but didn't comfort. Laundresses soaked garments in streams or vats, scrubbing with paddles or feet. They rinsed, wrung, and hung the garments on hedges or lines. They knew which stains could be removed and which would stay forever. A certain splash, a certain smudge, it told a story. And some stories weren't meant to be told. Let's talk now about superstition again. In some villages, people believed that waste carried not just disease, but misfortune. If you stepped in the wrong puddle, you invited bad luck. If a bird relieved itself on your shoulder, it was a blessing, or a curse, depending on the direction it flew. If your chamber pot cracked, it meant death in the family, or love, or a change in fortune. The interpretations varied. Toilet-related omens were real, not because they made sense, but because they offered control. If you couldn't avoid the smell, you could at least try to read its meaning. And people did. They told stories about monsters in the pit, about demons that whispered through the hole, about spirits that watched from the shadows. Not everyone believed them, but no one scoffed, because scoffing invited attention, and attention invited accidents. There were practical fears too. Falling in was the biggest. Cesspits were deep, slippery, often unlit. If a child fell, it was a race. If an adult fell, it depended. Some were rescued, others were not, and the smell lingered forever. There's a record of one man, a courtier, who fell into a palace latrine during a party. He survived, but he was never the same. Not socially, not spiritually. He left court soon after. Whether it was shame or trauma, the result was the same. The pit took more than dignity. Now shift again, across cultures. While Europe struggled with wooden seats and waste-filled streets, other parts of the world were experimenting with more advanced systems. In ancient Japan, toilets were divided by class. Aristocrats used lacquered wood seats. Peasants used the fields. But even the poorest homes had a system of collecting waste for use as fertilizer, called night soil, a practice that continued well into modern times. China had latrines with ceramic bowls, even water-flushing mechanisms in some regions. The Tang dynasty developed public toilets with hand-washing basins. Not widespread, but notable. In the Islamic world, ablution was central. Water was used for cleansing, not wiping. Toilets were designed with running water, and users washed after each use. Hygiene was part of prayer, not preference. In contrast, Europe resisted water. Water near waste seemed dangerous. Wetness meant rot. Dryness was safer. This belief, though flawed, guided many choices. Chamber pots were emptied carefully. Wells were covered. Rain was feared. And so we return again to the chamber pot. It was more than a convenience. It was a necessity, a tool, a symbol of survival. Most were plain, clay or metal. Some were decorated, even humorous. One popular design had a face at the bottom, smiling, grimacing, leering. The idea was amusement, or shame, or both. People personalized their pots, scratched names into them, painted them, broke them in anger, gave them as gifts. Yes, really, a chamber pot could be a wedding gift, a family heirloom, or a joke between friends. It all depended on who you were and how you used it. In inns, chamber pots were shared, emptied by servants, cleaned irregularly. Travelers brought their own cloths, sometimes even their own seats. You didn't trust unfamiliar holes. And in the middle of the night, when the fire burned low and the wind howled through the cracks, you reached for your pot. Not because it was clean, but because it was there. You squatted. You balanced. You exhaled. And in that moment, you were connected not just to your body, but to the 1,000 years of people who had done the same, who had endured the discomfort, who had found a way. Because the toilet, in all its forms, is one of the oldest truths in history. Every king, every peasant, every monk and merchant, they all had to go. And they all had to decide how and where and what came next. And so did you. Let's pause for a moment, and not just to rest our feet or stretch our legs, but to appreciate what medieval people didn't have, and how they still made do. Because while it's easy to look back with modern eyes and shudder at the lack of plumbing or soap, it's harder and more meaningful to look back and understand. They didn't know about germs, but they knew what made them sick. They couldn't test water quality, but they knew when it tasted wrong. They didn't have scented candles or lavender sprays, but they burned herbs. They opened windows. They scattered flowers on floors. Not because it eliminated the smell, but because it pushed back just enough to give them a sense of control. Now, walk with me into a medieval hospital. Not the kind you'd want to stay in. A large stone building with long wooden beds, a few flickering candles, and the faint, sour smell of sickness. The floors are covered in straw, not to soften your step, but to soak up what falls. Blood, vomit, other things. Some patients are dying. Some are recovering. A few are simply poor and cold and pretending to be sick for a warm place to sleep. But here, too, people need toilets. There's a chamber pot beside each bed. Sometimes, too, the staff, if they can be called that, empties them when they remember. If they're not too tired. If they're not tending to someone bleeding from a wound that never healed right. Outside, behind the building, there's a latrine. Not marked, not isolated, just a row of wooden seats above a trench. A screen of woven branches gives a little privacy. Barely. The smell reaches around corners. And when the wind shifts, even the chapel fills with it. Patients are wheeled out or carried, if they're able. If not, they go where they lie. The linens are changed weekly. If they're lucky, in these spaces, toilets aren't an afterthought. They're part of the suffering, part of the care, part of the reason some don't recover. Because the closer waste is to wounds, the more likely death follows. And yet, they tried. They washed hands. They burned old straw. They lit incense and muttered Latin prayers. Cleanliness and piety were inseparable. Now step into a small home. A weaver's cottage, maybe. One room. A thatched roof. A hearth in the center, smoking faintly. Chickens underfoot. A baby wrapped in wool near the fire. There's no toilet. Just a pot. Unglazed. Maybe cracked. Rinsed with cold water from the barrel outside. Everyone shares it. In the morning, it's emptied behind the shed. Not far. Just far enough. The family doesn't think about it much. It's not something to dwell on. It's just another task, like milking the goat or sweeping the ashes. But if you ask them about privacy, they'd laugh. What privacy? No one had their own space. Not really. Not unless they were rich. And even then, not always. Children saw their parents use the pot. Grandmothers squatted without ceremony. Visitors turned their backs out of courtesy. Modesty was a luxury for another time. And when someone died, the pot was washed, stored, reused. Life went on. Let's return to castles now. Because not all castles were grand. Many were cold, damp fortresses that barely qualified as homes. But in the largest, in the most luxurious, some garderobes were designed with cleverness. They were angled over corners so that wind could blow the smell away. Some had pipes made of lead or carved stone to funnel waste further down the wall. Others had double chutes, one above the other, so that servants on the lower floors could access and clean without climbing up. These were marvels of engineering for the time. And yet, they still smelled. Because waste lingers. You can design the chute, shape the seat, place it in a clever corner. But the smell will find you. Especially in summer. Especially in crowded halls. So people coped in other ways. They wore herbs in their sleeves. They chewed mint. They dabbed rose water behind the ears. Perfume became not just vanity, but armor. Some nobles carried scented handkerchiefs. Others held pomanders, tiny metal spheres filled with spices or dried flowers. They'd lift them to their nose when they passed the garderobe, or when they passed the lower servants, or when they passed the street. Because the smell wasn't confined to toilets. It was everywhere. Let's go to church. Yes, even here, toilets existed. In some monasteries, the latrines were connected to the cloister, tucked into stone extensions overhanging a stream. But in smaller churches, it was less elegant. There was a chamber pot in the back, covered, forgotten. Priests relieved themselves like everyone else, quietly, discreetly, and sometimes, during long services, uncomfortably. Church yards weren't always sacred either. At night, when streets were quiet, people slipped through the gates to relieve themselves behind gravestones. It was forbidden, of course, but so was being poor. So was hunger. So was desperation. The records are full of finds. Men caught urinating on chapel walls. Women squatting behind tombs. Teenagers caught relieving themselves in the choir loft. Some were punished. Others simply vanished into the shadows. Now let's think about what happened next, after the waste was gone. Where did it go? In towns, it flowed into rivers, or canals, or seeped into the ground. In castles, it pooled in cesspits, stone-lined holes beneath the tower. In villages, it soaked into the soil. No one treated it. No one filtered it. They simply let it disappear. And so disease brewed. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery. They didn't understand the source, but they saw the patterns. They avoided certain wells. They burned their straw bedding. They blamed demons or bad air. And sometimes they were right, just not for the reasons they thought. In some places, they built bridges not to cross rivers, but to get above the waste. Elevated walkways, planks between houses, anything to keep boots dry. But in flood season, nothing helped. The waste rose, the streets turned slick, and the smell became a fog. Now imagine a traveler arriving in such a town. He's weary. He needs rest, food, relief. He finds the inn, pays the coin, gets a bed, and then he asks, quietly, where to go. The innkeeper gestures, a curt nod toward the alley, or the back courtyard, or the bucket beside the stairs. It's not elegant, it's not ideal, but it's enough. He does what he must, and in the morning, he's gone. Let's journey now to a medieval festival, a crowded, bustling, chaotic gathering of people from all walks of life. Peasants, nobles, merchants, beggars, jugglers, friars, all swarming a market square thick with shouting, song, and the scent of roasting meat. But as the music rises and the wine flows, one problem becomes impossible to ignore. Everyone eventually has to go. Where? There were no porta potties, no designated areas with tidy signs. Instead, people went where they could, behind tents, into alleys, in the shadow of a wagon. Some found trees, others found corners, and some didn't care. During festivals, especially the more raucous ones like May Day or Midsummer, modesty took a back seat to merriment, and toilets, such as they were, overflowed. Chamber pots behind stalls, buckets that hadn't been emptied in hours, trenches dug and quickly abandoned. The smell clung to the laughter, mixed with it, became part of it. And then there was the straw. Everywhere straw. It was laid across the ground not for comfort, but to soak up the filth. Not just the spilled wine or food scraps, but the other things, the darker, wetter things. Straw that crackled underfoot in the morning and squelched by dusk. And when the festival ended, and the musicians packed up, and the travelers disappeared down muddy roads, the cleanup began. Which is to say, it didn't. The wind did what it could. So did the rain. Dogs and pigs helped in their own way. But the stink lingered for days, even weeks. So yes, joy had its cost. Now let's visit the prisons. Toilets in medieval prisons? Barely. Most cells had nothing but a corner and a bucket. And sometimes, not even the bucket. Prisoners relieved themselves in the same place they slept. They shared space, air, disease. The walls were wet with condensation. The straw beneath them rotted. Rats ran across their legs at night. In some dungeons, there were drainage holes, carved grooves in the floor that channeled liquid waste toward a central shaft. But these were rare luxuries. Most prisoners simply sat in their filth and waited. And if they were sick, if dysentery swept through the cells, Then the floor wasn't just dirty. It was death. Even executions were not spared the reality of waste. It's a quiet historical truth, but a real one. When people died, especially by hanging, their bodies often emptied themselves. Public executions came with smells, and sometimes crowds didn't just recoil at the violence, they recoiled at what came after. A noble might have his body cleaned and dressed, but the commoner? He swung, and what spilled stayed. Let's move on now, up the mountains through the fog, to a monastery built on the edge of a cliff. It's isolated, quiet, built by hand with stone and devotion. And here, the latrines are clever. They hang over the edge, literally. A wooden box, braced with beams, juts out over the ravine. Inside, a seat, a hole, and the abyss. When the monks relieve themselves, their waste falls into the canyon below. No cleanup, no smell, just the wind. But in winter, it's dangerous. Ice on the beams, wind in the robes. A single misstep, and the monk follows the waste. And so, they go carefully, slowly, one hand on the wall, one foot in front of the other. Even holiness has to go somewhere. Let's descend again, this time into the sea, not literally, but to the coast, where sailors prepare for months-long voyages. What about toilets on ships? The truth, they barely existed. On smaller vessels, there might be a plank extended over the edge of the ship, with a hole in the center, called the head. That's where you went, literally overboard, sometimes with a rope tied around your waist. In storms, you held on for dear life. Or you didn't. On larger ships, there were sometimes wooden boxes at the prow or stern, simple seats over open water. But they were crude, exposed, no privacy, just wind and salt. Below decks, no toilet, just buckets, or corners, or nothing at all. Sailors relieved themselves in the night, in secret, in shared spaces. And when the ship rocked, so did the waste. Some ships had rules. Clean the bucket, empty it daily. Others didn't bother. By the end of a long voyage, the smell was woven into the sails, into the ropes, into the skin of the men who had no other choice. But they didn't complain. They joked about it, made songs, gave names to the worst-smelling sailors, called them Two-Bucket Tom or Stinkfoot Jack. Laughter, as always, made survival easier. Back on land, the nobles lived differently, but not always better. Yes, they had private garderobes. Yes, they had servants to clean them. But they also had robes with layers, corsets with laces, gowns that trailed along stone floors. Using the toilet wasn't quick. It involved planning, assistance, removal of layers, and then more layers, followed by the retightening of strings, the smoothing of folds, the reapplication of perfume. A single visit to the garderobe might take 20 minutes. And if you were at court, surrounded by dozens of other courtiers, watching, judging, the pressure to be discreet was immense. Whispers circulated about who took too long, about who smelled, about who accidentally soiled a hem during a feast. Even queens had accidents, and when they did, it wasn't private. It became gossip, and gossip, in royal circles, was sharper than any blade. Let's stop here. Not for long, just long enough to remember that all of this, every trench, every pot, every crude wooden seat, was a solution. Not a perfect one, not always a pleasant one, but a way to manage a need as old as breath. And the people who lived with these systems, they endured, they laughed, they cleaned, they endured, because sometimes survival means squatting in the cold, holding your breath, and hoping the wind is on your side. The day begins before the sun, and it begins often with a need. Imagine a small medieval farmstead, the roof thatched, the walls timbered, the air chilled with dew. Inside, a family stirs from under woolen blankets. The fire has long since died, and the cold reaches into every corner of the single room. The father rises first. He's stiff from sleep, his knees creak. Before he stretches, before he speaks, he grabs the chamber pot. It's wooden, handcrafted, a little cracked on the edge. Inside, the remnants of yesterday, and perhaps the day before. He steps outside, past the door hanging slightly off its hinge, past the pig sleeping in the corner. He walks to the midden, a shallow pit behind the fence, ringed by stones, covered in flies, though it's still morning. Here he pours the contents, watches them sink into the muck, adds a scoop of straw to keep the smell down. This is his routine. Not noble, not poetic, but necessary. Back inside, the rest of the family is waking. A boy, a girl, the mother. They share the bed. They share the pot. And now it must be cleaned, rinsed with rainwater, wiped with rags, set back under the bed for next time, because there will be a next time. And this cycle is how most people lived. Not just once, not just for a year, but for centuries. Let's move now to a more surprising place, the schoolhouse. Yes, even medieval children needed to go. In monastic schools, the latrines were often rudimentary, shared holes behind the chapel. No doors, just stalls, a bench with openings. You learned quickly not to look left or right, and no giggling. Giggling during lessons earned you a slap. Giggling in the latrine earned you silence, because no one wanted to talk about what happened there. Especially not after that time little Alfric fell in. He was fine mostly, but the story stuck. And so did the smell. In wealthier schools, chamber pots were kept in the corners, sometimes behind curtains, emptied once a day. Maybe. The children knew better than to make a mess. Punishment wasn't just a scolding. It was shame. It was being made to clean it in front of others. It was whispered laughter during lessons. It was a nickname that lasted until you were grown. So they held it, waited, hoped. Even children understood the politics of waste. Now walk with me to a medieval brothel. Quietly. Inside, candles flicker. Curtains sway. Voices murmur. Laughter low and forced. Perfume thick in the air, fighting against another smell, earthier, older. Each room has a chamber pot. Some are porcelain, imported from the East. A luxury, a statement. Others are metal, cold to the touch. Always cold. The women clean them between clients. Or don't. It depends on the night, on the mood, on how fast the door closes and opens again. Toilets here are tools of necessity, but also symbols. A full pot means a busy night, an empty one, a quiet one. And sometimes coins are dropped inside, by accident or on purpose, because not everyone wants to be remembered for their generosity, or their shame. So the women reach in, fish them out, wash their hands in rose water. Move on. No one talks about it. No one has to. Let's journey again, this time into the wild. What if you were a traveler, a pilgrim on the road to Santiago, or Canterbury, or Rome? Where would you go? Wherever you could. Behind trees, into the bushes, alongside the road when no one was looking. You carried a cloth, a bit of linen or wool, sometimes moss, sometimes nothing. If you had coins, you might pay for a spot behind a tavern, a chamber pot near the fire. But if you had nothing, then the world was your latrine, and shame followed your footprints. Some pilgrims used walking staffs with carved notches, not to count the miles, but to scrape the mud from their shoes. And not just mud. The roads were crowded, the ditches full. You walked with your eyes down, and your breath held. And if you reached your destination, The first thing you sought, before prayer, before food, was relief. Because your body had waited long enough. Let's peek now into a tower. A noble woman's chamber, high above the grounds. Curtains drawn, cushions fluffed, a small dog asleep at her feet. Beside her chair, a closed stool, a wooden box with a padded seat. Inside a pot, glazed, covered. When she needs it, her maid helps her, lifts the layers of silk, holds her hand. It is quiet, respectful, practiced. Afterwards, the pot is carried away, down 3 flights of stairs, through the servants' quarters, emptied into the garden trench, where the flowers always bloom brighter. She never sees it again. She never thinks of it. But the maid does. The maid knows the weight, the warmth, the sound. She knows that the noble woman had pork last night, that her stomach churns in the mornings, that she uses lavender water in summer and mint leaves in winter. The maid knows everything and says nothing. Let's step away now, from the grand halls, the crowded streets, the filthy alleys. Let's find a forest, a quiet one. A hermit lives here, alone, in a hut made of branches and bark. He hasn't seen another soul in weeks, maybe months. His toilet? A hole in the earth, dug behind a fallen log, covered with moss and leaves. When he goes, he speaks a prayer, not to be clean, but to be humble. He sees waste as part of the cycle. His own waste feeds the soil feeds the roots feed the tree, and the tree shades his hut. It's not modern, it's not hygienic, but it's honest, and in that honesty, he finds peace. Let's step now into a monastery. Not the cold, crumbling kind from legends, but a well-kept one. Stone walls washed in sunlight, herbs growing in orderly rows, quiet chanting from the chapel. And at the heart of it all, discipline. Monks lived by rules. Rules for rising, rules for eating, rules for prayer, and yes, even rules for relieving themselves. In the rule of Saint Benedict, written centuries before, it was made clear: modesty, silence, cleanliness. The toilet was not a place of conversation. It was not a place for lingering. It was part of the cycle of obedience. In large monasteries, there was a structure called the reread order, a communal latrine attached to the dormitory. A long stone room, narrow and dim, with seats carved over a running channel of water. Not luxurious, but functional. The water often came from a diverted stream, channeled with care and effort. It flushed the waste away. Not perfectly, but enough. Monks used these latrines in silence, often at night, with only the moon for light. Robes dragging along stone floors, sandals soft against ancient steps. Some brought candles, some did not. And if they broke silence, if they laughed or spoke, they confessed, because even that, laughter in the wrong place, was seen as a failure of discipline. Now imagine the novices, young, uncertain, new to the rhythm of monastic life. They struggled to adjust, to hold it during the hours of prayer, to rise before dawn and walk through cold cloisters just to find the proper place. Sometimes, they didn't make it in time, and shame followed them like a shadow. But the older monks remembered. They too had once struggled, and so they showed quiet mercy. A nod, a rag handed over without a word, a candle left by the bed. Let's now return to the city, but in disguise. You are not yourself. You are a thief. It's midnight. You've crept across rooftops, down alleys, into houses. You've taken coin, a ring, a loaf of bread. But your body doesn't care about your plans. You need to go. You cannot stop long. You cannot knock on a door. You cannot ask politely. So you find a corner, a shadowed stairwell, behind the butcher's shop. near the wall that always leaks rainwater. You relieve yourself quickly, silently, and in that moment, you are not a thief. You are just a person, human, cold, and vulnerable. And then, just as quickly, you vanish into the dark. Let's now peek inside a manor. A feast is underway. Roasted boar, stewed pears, ale and wine poured until the cups blur. And the guests, nobles, knights, bishops, laugh too loudly, eat too much, drink past the point of memory. But their bodies do not forget. At some point, one by one they rise. They slip behind tapestries, through narrow hallways, up winding stairs, to the garderobes, long wooden seats over stone chutes. Cold but private. Some linger, others are quick. A servant waits outside, with cloth, with water, with silence. Later, when the feast resumes, no one mentions the missing moments. But everyone knows, because even the richest men still need relief. And some take longer than others. Let's now look down, into the pit. Literally, a cesspit. A hole dug beneath a city house, lined with brick, covered by a slab of wood or stone, accessed from a chute above or a hidden door. And sometimes, when the pit filled, someone had to go in. The gong farmer. A job both reviled and necessary. He arrived at night, with buckets, with ropes, with a lantern that barely lit more than a few feet. He removed the waste, by hand, by shovel, by sheer, desperate labor. It paid well, by medieval standards, because no one else wanted to do it. The smell clung to him for days, his clothes soaked in lime and vinegar, his boots ruined, his hands raw, and when people passed him in the street, they stepped wide, held their breath, crossed themselves. But he kept the city running. He kept the streets cleaner, the pits emptier, the diseases, perhaps, slightly fewer. And for that, history barely remembers him. But we do. Let's now walk beyond Europe, to the Middle East, to a city of stone and sunlight. Damascus, Cairo, Baghdad. Here, the approach to toilets was different. There were public bathhouses, hammams, places of cleansing, of community, of ritual, and near them, toilets, rooms with flowing water, seats of carved stone, designed not just for use, but for washing. Because here, water was central, not an afterthought. Users did not wipe. They washed. They poured water from clay jugs, used the left hand, cleaned thoroughly. It was spiritual, physical, required before prayer. And so the toilets reflected that. No piles of cloth, no chamber pots tucked under beds, just water and cleanliness, and a different way of seeing the same need. Let's now follow a soldier. He marches for days. His armor chafes. His boots blister. He sleeps on cold ground, eats hard bread, drinks bad ale. And when he needs to go, he walks a few paces from the camp, digs a hole, crouches, covers it, and returns to the fire. In war, there is no luxury, no pot, no seat, just earth and privacy. If you're lucky, in the worst battles, there is neither. Men relieve themselves where they fall, and sometimes never rise again. Let's close this part not with filth, but with empathy, because the history of toilets is not just about systems. It's about people. People who woke up in the dark and stumbled toward a cold seat. People who whispered apologies as they emptied buckets into the rain. People who joked and struggled and endured. Because to be human is to carry this need, and to live through it day after day in the harsh world of the Middle Ages was not a failure. It was a triumph. Let's begin this chapter not in the castle, the village, or the street, but in the mind. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine being in a world without plumbing, without porcelain, without any privacy. A world where your most basic needs are governed not just by biology, but by architecture, class, weather, and custom. Where even the act of relieving yourself must bow to social order. Now open your eyes, because we're walking into a medieval inn. It's not glamorous. A timber frame, packed with travelers. Some are pilgrims, some are traders, some are just tired souls looking for shelter. There's a hearth in the main room, a few wooden tables, low stools. The air smells of old ale, sweat, cooked onions, and something deeper. You pay a coin for a bed. It's in the corner, near the window. The window doesn't open. There's a pot beneath the bed. It's half full, maybe from last night, maybe from this morning. You don't ask. At midnight you rise. You squat. You aim. The room groans around you. You're not alone. All of them, sleeping, breathing, sharing this space, this moment. You hear someone else use a pot nearby. You say nothing, because everyone is pretending it's normal. Because it is. Let's now look at inns from the outside. What did people do if they weren't staying the night? There was often a yard in back, a wall, a trough, a hole in the ground. Men went where they could. Women too, though less easily. They'd lift skirts, crouch low, and hope for speed. Some inns had latrines, simple outhouses, but many didn't. So the yard became a place of hidden shame, of quiet urgency, of hoping no one saw. The stable boys knew. They'd find more than manure in the corners. They'd sweep it away. Or not, because sometimes the muck was too much. Let's visit a nunnery, a place of quiet, of prayer, of rhythm. The sisters rose before dawn, chanted psalms, tended gardens, sewed garments, and yes, used toilets. Their facilities were not luxurious, but they were cared for. The latrines, shared, lined in stone, rinsed with water. Buckets stood nearby for cleansing. Cloth rags hung to dry on pegs. Everything had its place. No perfume here. No servants to scrub the pots. The nuns did it themselves, and they did it with reverence, because even waste was part of the divine cycle. The body must be honored, even in its humblest moments. They whispered prayers before entering, not for cleanliness, but for gratitude, that their bodies worked, that their lives, however modest, had order. Let's move on to the streets of Paris. Not the Paris of light and romance, the Paris of mud, the Paris of 1386. Narrow alleys, windows without glass, roofs with rot. People leaned from upper floors and dumped buckets. Some shouted "Garde à l'eau," a warning. Others didn't. The waste hit the street below, splashed, soaked into boots, into hems, into memories. In winter it froze. In spring it festered. Children played in it. Dogs drank from it. And yet, people still fell in love here. Still bought bread. Still sang songs. Still believed in better days. Because filth doesn't cancel joy. It only challenges it. Let's step now into the mind of a servant. She works in a manor. She wakes before the sun. She scrubs floors. She empties pots. She cleans the stool room. A small space beneath the staircase with 3 holes in a wooden bench. It smells. Always. She lights a candle. She sprinkles dried lavender. She lifts the lid. She sees what the noble family left behind. And she doesn't flinch. Because this is her work. And because she's done worse. When guests come, she readies the stool. Adds fresh cloth. Lights another candle. And when they leave, she returns. She wipes. She washes. She breathes through her mouth. She says nothing. Not to them. Not to herself. She simply carries the bucket. Out the back. Past the garden. To the ditch. And she empties it. and watches it fall, and then walks back inside, because the bread must be baked, and the chairs must be set, and life doesn't pause for filth. Let's turn our gaze now to the countryside, where shepherds wander, where cowherds nap beside fences, where farmers rise before the dew has dried. Where do they go? Wherever they are. Behind a tree, beside a wall, in a ditch. They don't have pots. They don't have cloth. They use moss, or grass, or nothing. They don't think about it. They don't talk about it. It simply happens, and then they return to their sheep, to their plows, to their sunburned lives. Let's now return to the chamber pot. This humble object, this basin of need. It saw everything: laughter, grief, sickness, birth, death. It sat beneath the bed, beside the chair, near the fire. It was handled by the highest lady and the lowest maid. It knew the truth of the household, the meals, the diseases, the secrets, and when it cracked, it was tossed aside, replaced, forgotten, but never unneeded. Let's end this part not in filth, but in understanding, because history is not only about kings and wars. It is about pots. It is about the moments between greatness, the things we hide, the things we carry, the things we do when no one's looking. And in that, there is a strange kind of nobility, a reminder that everyone, no matter how rich, how poor, how holy, how forgotten, must one day sit, must one day wait, must one day wash, and in that moment, all are equal. Let us begin this final part not with waste, but with water, because behind every toilet story in the Middle Ages, whether in a castle or a cottage, was the quiet, slow problem of what to do with the water. When it was there at all, water was life, yes, for drinking, for washing, for crops, but it was also danger. Waste in the water meant illness. Contaminated wells, muddy puddles full of runoff, streams turned brown with filth. People understood this, somewhat. They didn't know about bacteria, or parasites, or microbes, but they knew that certain water made you sick. That wells too close to the cesspit brought trouble. That cities with overflowing ditches saw more funerals. And so they tried. Some towns passed laws. No dumping chamber pots after sundown. No building a latrine above the neighbor's garden. Keep the ditches clear. Some people obeyed. Many did not. Because when it's late and cold and you're tired, the easiest solution is the quickest one. And history is built on easy solutions. Let's now revisit the garderobe, the castle toilet. We've talked about how it was a seat over a chute, often dumping straight into the moat or a pit below. But here's something less known. Some castles built them in clusters. 5, 6, even 10 seats side by side. Communal. Men sat together. Women sat together. Talking, laughing, or sitting in silence. To our modern eyes, this seems unthinkable. But privacy was a luxury. And shame, a smaller force than necessity. Some garderobes had tiny windows, slits for light. Some had shelves for candles, for herbs. Some had fabric hangings for a little dignity. And in the winter, the stone froze. The seat froze. The wind howled up the chute and kissed you right where you didn't want to be kissed. Still you sat. Because you had to. Let's go beneath the castle now. To the waste channels. To the places no one talks about in songs or stories. Here, servants walked with torches. They scraped dried excrement from the walls of the chute. They poured water, when it could be spared. They stirred the muck to help it flow. They hauled it in barrels, to the field, to the river, to the trench behind the orchard. And when the barrels leaked, they cursed softly and kept walking. No glory, just stink, but that stink made the roses grow. Let's visit a medieval hospital. Beds lined in rows, some with curtains, most without. The air smells of vinegar, herbs, sweat, and slowly fading hope. The sick lie still, the dying groan, and between the beds, pots, chamber pots, used by patients too weak to stand, emptied by nurses, monks, sisters, sometimes once a day, sometimes less. Flies buzz at the windows. The floor is scrubbed with lye. The walls are washed with lime. But the smell lingers. The knowledge lingers. That healing begins only when the waste is removed. And sometimes it never is. Let's now imagine a medieval child, too small to reach the seat, too shy to ask for help. They squat in the corner of the yard, behind the tree, by the wall. They wipe with grass, or leaves, or nothing. They pull their tunic down and return to play. Their mother sees. She sighs. She'll clean it later, because she remembers being small, and because shame is a learned thing. Let's now enter a church, a great cathedral, stones soaring overhead, light pouring through stained glass, choir boys singing, and behind the apse, hidden in a narrow corridor, there's a privy. A simple one, stone seat, small window, wooden door that sticks in the rain, used by the clergy, by the bishop, by the visiting monk. And on the wall beside the door, scratched in Latin, "We are all equal here. Let's visit the marketplace, a place of noise, of color, of shouting. Vendors hawk eels, turnips, cloth. Children run between carts, and in the alleys between stalls, the smell hits you. Urine, rot, waste. There is no city sanitation department, no toilets for public use, so people go where they can, behind barrels, between wagons, in drains that were meant for rain, and the merchants sweep the filth away, until it returns, and they sweep again. Let's now go to sea one last time, to a ship at anchor. The crew has not seen land in weeks. Food is low, tempers high. The men lean over the railing to relieve themselves, or they squat on the plank jutting over the water, gripping ropes for balance. Some fall, some slip. The sea takes them. Others don't even risk it. They use the corner of the deck. They wait for the rain to wash it away. And then they sleep beside the stain, because there is no other way. Let's now climb one more ladder, to an attic in a city house, a garret room. A woman lies in bed, Illinois, too weak to rise. She uses the pot beside her. It overflows. The servant is late. She breathes through her mouth. She says nothing. She stares at the beam above her bed and counts the cracks. She dreams of gardens, of rivers, of wind, of a place where toilets do not exist because nothing must be expelled. A perfect body, a perfect world. She smiles. Let's end now. Not in a ditch, not in a pot, but in a question. Why does this matter? Why tell the story of toilets? Because history is not just what we build. It's what we do, what we hide, what we share, the places where we sit in silence, breathe through the pain, and carry on. And in those places, in the cold morning light, in the corner of the field, on the edge of the castle wall, we are most human. So yes, this was a boring history, but maybe boring is just another word for real, and real is where we meet. Good night.